Hi everyone, how are you doing? Today we're going to be going over Chapter 7, Asian American Experiences. In particular, we are going to be focusing for this chapter a little bit more so on the Japanese Americans because they had a much more kind of prevalent history on the West Coast in terms of internment camps during World War II era. And after that, we're going to be having a short kind of glimpse and look at the Hawaiian Islands, and so the native peoples of Hawaii, and how essentially Hawaii came to be as an American territory, right? How we annexed it, and I'll go through the stories there. But as far as today, we are going to be detailing a bit more on the Japanese American side, and then later on, towards the later sections, we will be focusing also on Filipinos, more kind of Indo-Chinese peoples, and kind of have a general discussion there. But let's get into the thick of it with Japanese settlement. So before we even get into, let's say, the American side of Japanese Americans and their history, we have to understand what was happening in Japan at the time and what the kind of world conception of the Japanese were, especially in the United States at the time. So Japan, for the longest time, for centuries, had been ruled by something called the shogun. If anyone has seen movies, let's say, based off of feudal Japan with samurais and swords and bows and arrows and, the traditional kimonos, right? That kind of era, feudalistic Japan. That is what the shoguns were. They ruled in feudalistic times as essentially military dictators, right? And so that was what the rule was for hundreds of years. And then in the 1800s, we essentially had forced entry into Japan by the United States and other European powers, who essentially just came in on ships with cannons, blew the ports to all hell, and said, you are now going to be open for business, right? And so very quickly, Japan just was opened up to the West. However, that had initial ramifications because the trading agreements were a bit more unfair, and the Japanese started to really feel that they were at a disadvantage, right, technologically and in all of these various, negotiations. And so very quickly and we're not going to get too in-depth with this, but under Emperor Meiji, and it is named after his sake, right? So the Meiji Restoration, this young emperor that came into prominence, right, in Japan, understood that for Japan to survive and to thrive, they must modernize, and they must do so aggressively so that they could compete with America and the European nations, or if not, let's say, compete, at least hold their own, right? So they could have fair negotiations through trade deals and anything else. And so very quickly, Japan started going through a monstrously quick industrialization and modernization effort. And so as they started to do so, trade started to flourish. They started to expand into other countries and nations. And pretty soon, we started getting, let's say, settlement into California as well, as all of these kind of new lines of travel were opening up to them. And so one of the very first colonies we got were near Sacramento, the Wakamatsu colony. And so Japanese started to come over here in waves, right, as any of our other immigrant groups. And there is various names that they had for each generation. So just like we have, let's say first generation, second generation, they had specific terminologies for it. So the Issei were the individuals born in Japan. They were born in Japan and they moved over here, right? So they were Japanese. The Nisei were the first generation Japanese Americans. So these are the children of those early immigrants, and they were born here, having the experience of growing up in American life and culture, but at the same time having their Japanese heritage at home. The Sansei are the second generation Japanese Americans. So these are the grandchildren of the original immigrants. And so this is important because at this time that we're going to be discussing, right now it's going to be going towards the late 1800s, and then as we're fast forwarding into the World War II sort of time period, we're going to be dealing with a lot more Nisei and Sansei. And so, many of these early adopters and early immigrants, right, were, just like the rest of the world, farmers. The majority of the world was still kind of around farming and agriculture in the 1800s, and slowly in the 20th century, as everything really started to pick up and modernize, people started to clamor to the cities, right? And life in society began to change. But for the most part, right, early adopters, early newcomers were farmers, right? Trying to get land for yourself, trying to build up your own farm, and, live your best life. And so they had a variety of communities that they started to form, whether it was citrus farms, grape, vegetable, hops, sugar beets, what have you. Early other forms of immigrants started to, just like others, try to get into more skilled workforce jobs. Anything dealing with metallurgy, right? Being a blacksmith or dealing with precious metals, right? Going into jewelry, opening up your own business, maybe a grocery stand, right? Whatever it is that the community started to kind of form itself. And so some of these skilled trade jobs, however, were a bit more difficult for them to obtain because, once again, a certain level of nativism, right, and the people who are already working and living in the United States, they have an initial pushback to large waves of immigration. So unions were guarding their jobs, only trying to give it to their union members, right? That's the whole purpose of the union. The workers' union is to help and support each other. So if you have this entire wave of immigrants trying to compete for the jobs, the union is going to try to fight that. They did have a bit of a discrimination effect. So all of these Japanese, or as the terrible, kind of like nickname that they were given during this time, even especially up to World War II, once Japan, the Japanese Empire and the United States were at war with each other, the nicknames that they were being given, right, in very kind of derogatory fashion, ended up giving them a little more barrier of entry into, let's say, professional careers. And so they were given jobs, but let's say the high tier manager type positions, right, maybe were a bit more safely guarded. And then eventually we started getting federal laws against Issei citizenship and closing civil service opportunities to them. So we even start to see the federal government start to get involved a little bit more and to try to curb this enormous population waves hitting the west coast of the U.S. And, this was kind of a slow build of anti-Japanese rhetoric, right? From 1900 approximately upwards of, toward 1940 and 1940s for World War II. And so before we went to war in World War II, and, the Japanese were the enemy on the Pacific front, right, in the Pacific theater, there was an explosion, right, and I shouldn't say explosion. There was more of an expansion of anti-Japanese nativism on the West Coast because, once again, hundreds of thousands of Japanese started to make their way here and were trying to work, get their kids into school, and establish a life for themselves. But how is the global or even American perception of Japanese at this time? The perception is going to be everything that you are reading from the newspapers, right? About Japan, about Asia, and things going on there. And so one of the first things that people were reading about was the famous Russo-Japanese War. So this was a very short war, quote unquote, between the Russian Empire and the Empire of Japan. And so this was a monumental little war skirmish because this was the first time on a major theater of war that an Asian power defeated a European power. And so remember when we were talking about Japan trying to aggressively expand and industrialize and modernize themselves? They did so within like 20 years, 30 years, very, very quickly, turning it from a feudalistic, society into more of a modernistic society. And the reason because of that was because Emperor Meiji started to import the best of the best engineers from, let's say, the Hollands, right? The best kind of weapons manufacturers from Germany, the best ship makers, right, around the world for industrialized metal, steel ships. They were importing like mad, right, and just getting in there and industrializing. And so the first kind of big war was against the Russians, and they decisively defeated the Russians, right, on the kind of steppes of Manchuria in northern China/Mongolia. And so this was an enormous shift. So as folks are reading the newspapers, they're saying, wow, like the Japanese beat the Russians, right? The large, famous Russian Empire with the czars, with all of the gold and hundreds of thousands of troops that they have, right? This was like a big hit and a big conceptual change. A couple years later, the United States implements something called the Gentleman's Agreement, where because there were additional kind of growing resentments and nativist kind of reactions, that Japan promised to kind of stem and slow down future immigration, and sending let's say X, Y, and Z workers, etc., on the condition that Washington, D.C. agreed for better and equal treatment of Japanese immigrants. So Japan at this time is not, completely oblivious to what's going on. They understand that their people are spreading out, they're branching off into the U.S. and other territories as well. A lot of them ended up in Hawaii. And so they want the best treatment for their people. And so, as more Issei started to immigrate, right, towards the United States, many here, such as the white farmers, because many of them were coming over for farming, right, started becoming nervous over the labor supply and kind of the workforce. And so even California themselves started to pass things such as the 1913 Alien Land Act, prohibiting those individuals from becoming citizens and therefore purchasing land. So it caused a lot of Issei to leave their farms and move to the cities, because if you're coming over in the tens of thousands and you are trying to have farmland in order to farm, and then California says, no, sorry, you're aliens, etc., we're going to pass the Alien Land Act, you are now ineligible to purchase farmland. Okay, what else are you going to do? You're going to move to the cities and try to pick up wage work or open up a business or something like that. And so we're going to be seeing the ramifications of that slowly. This is a wonderful kind of visual representation and painting of, let's say, the Russo-Japanese War. And if you can tell, I'll get my pointer here. We have the sort of the Japanese imperial captain over here, and here the Japanese flag, the rising sun. And truly, Japan during this time was the rising sun, a growing military power, right? Having the best of both worlds, steeped in centuries of disciplined samurai warrior-like culture, right? Very disciplined, honing your craft, being exceptionally proud of your accomplishments and everything you do onto a daily minute-like basis, and marrying that with technological innovation. So not only were these new troops, fiercely disciplined and trained and loyal, they now had the best of the best weapons, right? Arming them. So truly a deadly combination. But we start to, of course, get the political cartoons. And so the one on the left-hand side here, I absolutely love, because it is Theodore Roosevelt, supposedly, right, kind of in between the Russian Tsar, obviously, draped in all of his gold and, his big golden crown and his golden cross, etc., and the Japanese rising sun, sort of militarized officer, right? And on the bottom there, let us have peace, right? With the olive branch there. If I ever email any of you and say, let me extend an olive branch, that's what that means. And so on the right-hand side also is a very kind of poignant look at what the world considered Japan or Asians to be at that time. Because Asia, whether we're talking about Japan, China, the Southeast sort of Indochina lands, they did not really consider them, let's say, to be on the same stage as the Europeans or the Americans. They still considered them to be a little more feudalistic. They considered them not to be as modernized and powerful. And so the cartoon on the right kind of personifies that, right? The Japan is this short Asian fellow, and Russia is this big, burly bear. However, because of the outcome of the Russo-Japanese War, the Japanese boxer over here says, haven't you had enough yet? And the Russian bear is kind of just reeling back, right? Almost just completely knocked out. And so it's a very interesting viewpoint onto the dynamic between the two. And so since we got the Japanese Americans now denied and being barred from entry into these farming communities, we start to see them settling in cities much more often. And so the Issei are moving into cities and forming these communities. We start to see credit associations, right? The Code, the Tonamishi, and the Mujin. All these credit associations now being created by fellow Japanese Americans to help new Japanese immigrants. And so they are trying to help provide investment capital for them. So if you come over and you want to start a business, they can help you out and give you a loan. Established banks did not want to give them loans at the time. And so this is way before any of this legislation came out. The banks have to be fair and not have discriminatory practices. So if you go to the bank and you say, please, I want to open up a business in Los Angeles, and can I please have a loan for that? I have some startup capital, I have some investments that I can put forth, etc. Maybe I have a small house as collateral, whatever. Just give me the loan. I want to start working. The bank could say, sorry, we don't give the money to your kind. Right? And they kind of just leave it at that. So this is still back in the day where things were being sorted out. And so we start getting these various credit associations, such as the Japanese Association of America, which were even more than a credit union. It was a credit union, and then on top of that, trying to help folks get settled. And so this was, they were providing English language skills to new folks, translation services, legal aid, employment advice, maternal and child care, and campaigning for the Issei to eventually get citizenship. So this was, a huge step in trying to help each other within the community, right? And to get better and to thrive, essentially. And so we see the Issei family, right, having a very close-knit loyalty, as we see with any other groups that we've studied so far, whether it's the Italians or Irish or African Americans, anyone else, right? You start to stick to your own kind, to your communities, right, and help each other grow stronger. Sort of the salad bowl theory again, folks. And so the Issei were now building these stronger communities, having community centers, businesses, and their temples of worship as kind of being the center of their community base. And so in conjunction with Japanese Americans kind of moving forward in the U.S. and kind of growing and establishing businesses and trying to have a better life for themselves, in conjunction with that, we see the Japanese Empire within Japan and the surrounding Asian regions growing more and more imperialistic. So if you could imagine, let's say you were born in the United States as a first-generation Japanese American. Your parents were originally from Japan, and you guys settled in the United States because you wanted to come here for a better life, right? And America is now your home. You were born here, whether it was Los Angeles, San Francisco, whatever. And the newspapers are just talking about, oh, Japan, they're now growing, they defeated Russia, they are kind of becoming this military power in the East. That doesn't necessarily have anything to do with you, right? You are now an American citizen, you just happen to be of Japanese birth and heritage. But we're going to see how those two modalities of thought are going to coincide in a very terrible way. And so within Japan at this time, we start to see the rise of Imperial Japan, as we were talking about before, in what is known as the Manchurian Incident. Now, this was a tremendously ramped up event in Japanese history because as Japan was growing and modernizing, as we were discussing previously, eventually you're going to hit a cap. Eventually you're going to hit a limit because the resources in your nation are going to prohibit you from growing anymore. And so Japan is not a large territory. It's a relatively small island. It's not on the same size as, let's say, Russia, right, with the vast sums of territory that they have. And so as Japan is growing stronger and they have a growing need for oil, rubber, wood and timber, all these natural resources en masse that they just don't have on the island, the closest huge landmass is China, specifically Manchuria, which is northeastern China, which was very rich in iron ore reserves, coal, and other kind of natural resources. And so they needed a prelude to war, right? A reason. And so it is known as the Manchurian Incident, where one of Japan's or a few Japan's railways were blown up in a quote-unquote terrorist way, a terrorist kind of sabotage. And so they claimed it was Chinese agents trying to start a vicious war with them. Now, the League of Nations, and if for those of you who do not know what the League of Nations is, it was the original precursor of the United Nations that we see today. After World War I, the League of Nations was created to hopefully, stem peace and have peace throughout the world. However, they did not have any military backing, so it was all bark, no bite. And so, but regardless, the League of Nations had a hunch that things were kind of out of whack a little bit. So they sent a 5-person committee to look at all of this stuff going on, and they ended up finding out that it was actually the Japanese that staged the entire thing and sabotaged the whole railroad system. And so Japan itself wanted a prelude to war, and boy, did they get it. And so here is a wonderful video on the Japanese invasion of Manchuria and the sabotage that they performed in order to have that excuse of entering into China with military force. And here's a map representation of China at the time. Let me get my pointer. So we have the island of Japan here, right? And then slowly but surely, they are annexing all of these territories. We start to see that, they start going up here in the various kind of island chains, start going up here, 1905, and just start to expand slowly but surely. And eventually, punching their way into Korea, right? They conquered all of Korea, and then punching their way into the Manchuria region and the surrounding kind of China regions here. And so a huge, vast amount of resources were now made available to mainland Japan so that they could grow their land force military. So that also, because of course Japan is an island nation, they can grow their incredibly powerful navy and start to expand into the relevant islands. And so amongst these kind of early actions of them going into mainland China, one of the main catalysts for, let's say, the future of China is going to be the Rape of Nanjing. And so as they were marching through China in the what is known as the Second Sino-Japanese War, they end up going into the capital of China, which was back then Nanjing, and absolutely devastating it. The battle took approximately 250,000 lives, just the battle itself. And then after that, in a very kind of imperialistic, ruthless, ancient history type of way, the generals just tell their men, after a hard-fought battle, go and have fun on the town. Loot, sack, and rape your way through, right? Whatever you want. And so the conquest mentality truly kind of gripped them. And so they kind of brutalized their way through Nanjing, the capital city. And so in China at the time, because they were going through this internal civil war between the nationalists and between this new rising Chinese Communistic Party, this gave the future leader of the Chinese Communistic Party, Mao Zedong, all of the sort of additional PR that he needed. Because now he said, look, the Western powers and now Japan are going through and burning and looting our cities. Look at the Rape of Nanjing, right? And that started to become this kind of central heated issue for many Chinese folks. And so almost immediately after the Rape of Nanjing, Mao Zedong immediately gathered over 1 million members for his war efforts, which would definitely help him win the war against the kind of nationalistic governments that came before him. And so all of this is intertwined, World history, everything is connected. It's very rare that it's kind of a singular, linear kind of path towards history. And because of the Rape of Nanjing is not typically taught too well in history books, there is a clip here where these, researchers were going in and just rediscovering this entire event and trying to bring it forth to light. So this is an interesting video to watch if you have a couple of minutes of free time. Now, here is let me get my pointer here. Here's the map of all of the Japanese holdings. If you notice from the previous map that I showed, which was here, Japan only just a little bit, right? Started going into China, and just a little few pockets here and there. The Philippines and all of this other territory was still kind of untouched. But given enough expansion, look, they completely kind of took over Thailand, French Indonesia, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, New Guinea, right? They're really, really expanding here and into the islands of the Pacific as well. And so Japanese expansion is slowly but surely steadily growing. And so as folks are, looking into or like just even reading the news, they are seeing this growing imperialistic Japanese kind of mantra here. And so folks get this conception of Japan is a growing, rising power, but it is not going to be until, if you can see all the way here on the right, it is not going to be until that final catalyst, that straw that broke the camel's back of Pearl Harbor, that Americans are truly going to finally, kind of come into a type of frenzy of war and start to look and turn at their Japanese neighbors and say, you guys did it, right? You are the ones that did Pearl Harbor. Even though, like we talked about, they could be first, second, whatever generation of Americans. They grew up in LA, they grew up in San Francisco, they've been going to school with your children. But the fact that their ancestral homelands and their cousins over in Japan, right, were creating all of this mayhem, suddenly, it's one and the same for many of the folks on the West Coast. And sadly, we've seen this happen time and time again. It seems to be human nature, right? Not only towards Americans, but right all around the world. And so even the closest time and representation in my lifetime right now that I can think of is in the last number of years, especially after 9/11. Everyone looked towards Middle Eastern folks and started to kind of go through the whole terrorist, quote unquote, right, kind of stereotype. God forbid if you had a long beard and you looked Middle Eastern in the last decade or so and you were walking through TSA at the airport, of course, you're the one who always gets a random check. And so, these themes come up again and again over time. And so we have here Pearl Harbor, right? The terrible launched mass attack surprise on the American naval bases. Now, for the longest of time, I've been trying to wrap my head around why the Japanese Empire would even consider attacking the United States in Pearl Harbor. So if we look at our good old map here, Japan has a sizable territory here, right? You would imagine that they would only be concerned with, let's say, going into the Soviet Union, Mongolia, or let's say further into China, right? Plenty of stuff to conquer over here on the map. Or maybe even perhaps Australia. I don't know. Why in the heck go towards the United States so far away? The concern here is that as World War II is kind of picking up steam and progressing, and Japan was part of now, in conjunction and in cahoots with Italy and with Germany, the United States was not in World War II as of yet, but they were already selling a bunch of ammunition, food, rations to the Allies, right? They've always been more closely linked with the Allies and Britain and France and so forth. And so I think they saw the writing on the wall and were seeing that the United States was going to go to war pretty soon. And so I think they wanted to merely have the first strike, right? An early strike. And so most of the Pacific fleet for the United States was actually housed in Pearl Harbor as far as the intelligence goes. And so I believe the methodology of the Japanese generals were, if we destroy enough of their naval fleet here in the West, it'll take them a few years to rebuild it. Within those few years, we will consolidate more power and strength, and then they're not going to be able to do anything, right? Because, once again, Japan was on a very good industrial streak, right? They were getting stronger and more powerful as the years were going by. So, not the worst argument in the world. However, they vastly underestimated the United States and their ability to build up very quickly, especially in an industrialized manner. And so on December 7th in the morning, Japanese launched a huge surprise attack. So we have, various, firsthand oral reports and even videos of just, countless amounts of Japanese fighter bombers, kind of flying over the Hawaiian Islands towards Pearl Harbor. And what is known as one of the most terrible attacks in U.S. history, which killed around 2,400 Americans. All of the bombs, right, were dropped onto the ships, thereby destroying them and making them essentially inoperable. And then, because these, this is back in the day, so the airplanes and the fighter jets, they don't have, a lot of fuel. They're going pretty slow. And so for all of these planes and fighters, it was a one-way trip. And so after they bombed the heck out of the American ships, right, and they were all their ammunition is expended, they would then use the airplanes in what is known as kamikaze, right, essentially a suicide mission. And they would take the airplanes and hit it against the ships for further damage. And so truly just devastating the fleet at Pearl Harbor. Franklin D. Roosevelt himself said on that very day, "A date which will live in infamy." And truly it was, because immediately after that, the United States and especially the U.S. Congress answered within hours of this attack and unanimously almost said, we are going to declare war. And so this was the introduction of the U.S. into the war effort. And so here is a wonderful battle scene from like a 2001 movie of Pearl Harbor, kind of, taking you into the moment, right, of the airplanes whizzing by, of all the bullets flying and the bombs being dropped. So this is only like a couple minutes of a scene, I think 3-4 minutes, but definitely pause the lecture, try to watch it. It kind of gives you that sense of kind of that large scale of these massive ships, right, of the U.S. fleet, and suddenly how a few bombs just completely annihilate them, right? How much damage was truly done. And, here's some photographs, right, we have of the damage, right? The ship's kind of sinking already and smoking from all of the fire inside of the ships themselves. And so truly it was a vicious attack, right? Airplanes whirling, right? Ships sinking, men trying to, swim for safety, etc. And then very shortly after, of course, the United States newspapers start to sensationalize the entire event, saying, "War, Oahu bombed by Japanese planes." And so very quickly, we have this war fervor, right, coming up. And we have this rhetoric of the enemy is here to attack us, right? It is us versus them. And so in a typical war fashion, right? And so, very quickly, the perception against Japanese, whether that is folks living in Japan within the Japanese Empire at the time, or even extending to Japanese Americans who are American citizens, but of Japanese heritage. And that war fervor and discrimination is going to seep in to them as well. And so as we are eventually going to be seeing, well, this is not too much of a, modern U.S. history course, but eventually the Pacific Theater, right? We rebuild our fleets. We push through the Pacific Theater in one of the most bloodiest wars the U.S. has ever seen. Capturing every single island in the Pacific was absolute hell. Because like we talked about before, that samurai mantra that the Japanese had, in addition to new weaponry, they were fearsome warriors, some of the toughest soldiers. And so every single island that we were hopping from, right, kind of in an island hopping manner, right, kind of pushing towards Japan, the U.S. body count was just staggering. First island, it took us like a few thousand deaths. Second island, the U.S. toll was like 15,000. The third island was like 25, 30,000, right? Our death toll kept increasing as we were going on. It was absolutely brutal. Eventually, we ended up getting the atomic age. And in a very kind of Japanese / Japanese American history perspective, we end up getting, and you can just focus on the second half of this slide over here towards the bottom, the Manhattan Project, the very famous one where it was a secret American program developed and tested in New Mexico. And so we ended up getting the nuclear weapons, the atomic bombs. And so in 1945 in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we dropped the two only nuclear weapons on large city centers ever. Hiroshima killing 70,000 immediately, radiation killing another 140,000, and then Nagasaki killing another 70,000, and just as many through radiation after that. And so horrific amounts of death tolls. And so as people are reading through all of these news and they're seeing the new like atomic, let's say, age and military prowess, right? Military strength of the United States, the devastation is just untold and unfathomable, opening up the 20th century to the terrors of nuclear warfare. And of course the aftermath, right? The cities destroyed, the buildings in ruins. Life itself has seemed to kind of turn into the worst and look more like a post-apocalyptic landscape. People, right, if you did not burn or die in the first fiery death of the bomb, then radiation seeps into you, thereby forming cancer, tumors, illnesses, etc. And so here's an aerial view of the Japanese cities. And so as you can tell, just wide devastation, right? Almost all the buildings destroyed and rubbled in some form. People having deformities and scars. These are burns. So if you were at a safe enough distance away from the fiery hellstorm, but you weren't too far enough. And so in a very famous, just like you see in the movies, if the atomic bomb drops, there's a huge blinding flash of light. But that flash of light, if you're close enough, can pierce your flesh and burn and sizzle it. And so folks were trying to get treated for all of these horrific burns that they ended up receiving. But as all of this is happening on the world stage, as the war is unfolding, as we eventually get into the Pacific theater and fight our way, which will eventually lead towards dropping the atomic bombs in Japan, thereby ending World War II. As all of this is happening on the world stage, what is happening here at home in the United States as far as the Japanese American community on the West Coast, in cities such as Los Angeles, San Francisco, and even extending into Oregon and Washington State? As soon as Pearl Harbor hits in 1941 through 1945 ends up being terrible years for the Japanese American community, as you might imagine. Pearl Harbor shocked Americans, right? It absolutely shocked them, especially Californians, since they were the bulk of the West Coast. And so 90% of most of these like Japanese immigrants and their kids, around 90% were living in California at the time. And so early in the war, right, as the Pacific Theater is opening up and the United States is trying to enter World War II and fight off the Japanese, the Imperial Japanese forces end up getting early victories in Guam, Wake, Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, right? They start to expand. And so very quickly, the U.S. government and the military starts to think to themselves, we have over 100,000 Japanese and their kids living on the West Coast. God forbid if they're spies and they're going to help in a coup or something of California, right? So all of these kind of theories are spinning in their heads. So the FBI starts to investigate Japanese Americans, and within a few months starts to arrest a couple thousand of them to interrogate them, right? Especially the leaders of the communities. As it so happens, out of all of their suspicion, only one was arrested from all of the kind of heated, search. And he was only arrested because he forgot to register his importing firm to the government. So it was a bunch of like IRS tax stuff. Whoop-de-doo. But we start to see that the federal government really starts to ramp up their anti-Japanese rhetoric here. And so in 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt makes an executive order to officially relocate forcibly the Issei and the Nisei, or the Japanese immigrants and the Nisei, their first generation Japanese American citizens, living within California, Oregon, and Washington. So by 1942, we saw more than 100,000 Japanese Americans living in around 16 plus temporary assembly centers. Actually, a few more eventually, but they were dispersed throughout all of these centers, essentially called internment camps. And this is a terrible moment in U.S. history because many of these folks, if not most of them, right, especially the Nisei, the ones born here, They are American citizens that happen to be of Japanese ancestral heritage. And so the conversation here turns towards, can the U.S. government arbitrarily arrest and detain, almost on an indefinite period of time, a U.S. citizen, right, with no basis at all? Can they just detain them, right, and essentially throw them in internment camps? So as this was going on, all of these individuals were thrown out of their homes, told you can only bring, let's say, one suitcase each, and that's it. You're going towards the camps. What happens to your business? It's going to shut down. What happens to the home that you were living in? It's going to get repossessed or sold by the banks. All your possessions are going to get taken as well, right? So these folks lost their entire livelihoods, many of them. We do have stories, thanks to some wonderful neighbors that they had, that, let's say, bought their house cheap and their cars and everything else, and then once they were released, they gave it back to them, right? So we do have many stories and instances such as those of kind, helpful neighbors that they had, that were seeing the situation and just saying, this is not right whatsoever, right? Because after you lived with your wonderful neighbor for like 10, 20, 30 years, and this craziness is happening, obviously your humanity, right, is going to come into play. But for many of them, right, they were getting a huge, terrible financial hit. And so, of course, they enter into litigation, taking this to the courts. And eventually, in 1944, the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously decided that incarcerating law-abiding U.S. citizens had no constitutional authority. So the camps were immediately closed, but the hearts of all of these families were not necessarily mended. Out of anything in this lecture and slide that you are going to view video-wise, please pause the lecture and watch George Takei's video here. He was a young boy when they took him from his home in Los Angeles and threw him into an internment camp. He lived the experience as a young child, and he saw his parents' experiences and what they went through. This is a first-hand account. For those of you who do not know who George Takei is, in like the old Star Trek shows with Sir Patrick Stewart, George Takei was like part of the Star Trek family. So he's a famous like actor, and so definitely watch his interview. And he gives a very he makes very excellent points on why the U.S. government did what they did, what they were trying to achieve, what kind of rhetoric they were having against Japanese Americans, and so it is a really eye-opening interview. Definitely watch it if you can. Here, we have more of a, it's a few minutes long, but kind of like a History Channel-esque sort of summary, right, of Japanese Americans forced into essentially what they say concentration camps. It's not really concentration camps. They need to rename the title, but internment camps. And George Takei in the previous video makes excellent points too. He's like, they should not be called Japanese internment camps. They should be called Japanese American internment camps, because that is the true tragedy, right, of the camps. But a general summary, so watch the video if you have a couple minutes of time. And so imagine if you were the Japanese American family living during this day and age, let's say in 39, 40, 41, and right, you have all of this slander written on your walls. No Japs wanted, right? That term being very derogatory towards them at the time. So they were just, destroying their windows, painting all of this kind of muck and trash all over. And so very soon, right, you start getting the orders that you are to be relocated, and you are only allowed, let's say, the clothes on your back and let's say a small bag, right, for every individual. And so you're not having much, you're just being forced to go into, right, these various camps that you have no idea what's going to go on. And so many of these families obviously agreed. They're law-abiding citizens. But, to their detriment, right, their sort of complacency to go after all of this, craziness led towards them losing, right, a lot of the stuff that they had worked so hard for. And so a lot of these kids were growing up for a couple of years, right, in their youth, in these camps, surrounded by barbed wire. If you can see on the right-hand side, that's a tower, right? Those are soldier towers because we had soldiers guarding them every second of the day. And so these soldiers were there, right, protecting and kind of overseeing by the U.S. military to make sure that there is no sort of espionage going on. If those mountains in the background look semi-familiar, this camp here is called Manzanar. So this is around 3 hours outside of Los Angeles, kind of going up into the mountains and the hills. And so Manzanar is definitely, only a couple hours trip away from Los Angeles. And so there's a sort of museum there, right? And kind of, some wonderful memorial, statues and everything else kind of historically. So if you have the time, definitely visit it. It's a very interesting, albeit sad part, right, of U.S. history. And so we have a generation of young, kids growing up in these camps that are essentially being told, you are traitors, you are spies, and we do not want you here, right? We're distrustful of you. And that's no way to treat, American citizens. We're having very similar conversations in recent news as far as the U.S. border with Mexico goes, right? We're having huge amounts of immigration. We're having huge amounts of, let's say, detainment, let's say ICE moving through and telling, young kids, you have to get out of the country, you're going to be arrested, etc. Similar rhetoric. Obviously, it's not a one-to-one, right? Because there are different historical periods of time and different scenarios. But sometimes the rhetoric is similar here. And so as a historian, I'm very sort of wary, right, of hearing a lot of this rhetoric because sometimes it, rings the old bells, right, of what we're just discussing here. Hawaii. So, Hawaii is, because, Asian Americans and Hawaii is, also a big topic, right, because Hawaii is one of our states. Hawaii is an interesting place. I visited Hawaii many years ago with my family. We went to the island of Oahu, and I actually visited Pearl Harbor myself and was kind of going into the ships, right, and kind of having photos there. I'm not going to post up any photos of myself there because I was a young, cute, chubby kid, and so I want to spare you the sight of my chubby cheeks going through the ship sort of tunnels and stuff. But it was a really cool experience, so I definitely recommend anyone to do that. But as far as Hawaii goes, how did Hawaii become a state? Hawaii used to be a monarchy, a kingdom, right? And previous kings and queens. And Hawaii's last queen, for the love of God, I always try to pronounce her name. Hopefully I'm pronouncing it correctly. Liliuokalani, but Queen Lily for short. She was the last queen of Hawaii, and at that time, the United States started to have larger connections, business-wise, with the Hawaiian Islands because we had enormous sugar plantations there, pineapple plantations, and all of this kind of agricultural farming. Eventually, many of these agricultural farming and corporate businessmen started to say, you know what, this is not enough profit for us. So they teamed up with some rebel groups, and they forced a coup d'etat against the queen. And the U.S. military did nothing, and they actually, accepted this because they wanted the port of Hawaii. And so, this is before all of this World War II business was happening, right? This is in the late 1800s, at the turn of the century, right? 1898, 1899. And so, they wanted Pearl Harbor as well for their ships. And so the U.S. military was like, all right, great. And so the last Queen of Hawaii was overthrown by these business corporate interests. And here's a wonderful documentary here. And it's not too long. It's like 15 minutes long or something like that. And so if you have the time, definitely watch this. It kind of, brings the entire perspective close to home a little bit more. And so we have the last queen of Hawaii, Queen Lily, on the left-hand side at the beginning of her reign, and on the right-hand side towards, let's say, the middle portion of her reign, close to when she was dethroned. But the U.S. government was still kind enough, right, to let her live in Hawaii in her palace with all of her attendants and servants, because she was a central figure of Hawaii, right? She was sort of the ancestral family that was ruling the people, right? Descendant from the gods. And so in a very kind of monarchical way, right, they let her, kind of retain some of her, prestige until the day she passed. And so here we have more political cartoons of, let's say, Uncle Sam, right, the United States, sort of trying to, on the left-hand side, plugging up Hawaii and gobbling up Hawaii against Japanese ambition. And so hopefully the Japanese are not going to get their hands on Hawaii, but it's going to be an American territory. And on the right-hand side, right, the United States is trying to also gobble up Hawaii as their own, but Uncle Sam having his arm and his hand extended to the, as you can tell, let me get my pointer, the Japanese individual here, because his hat says Jap. And so he is also saying, no, Hawaii is mine, you stay away. And so it is a very geopolitical strategy as well, on top of being kind of the socio-cultural backlash, right, against a group of people and individuals. And so United States military eventually funneled their way into Hawaii and all the various kind of port settlements and the palaces and such, and made it their own state that is eventually going to incorporate itself into the United States. And with that, we have the end of Chapter 7. My final thoughts on the subject are the Japanese Americans ended up finding themselves in a very precarious situation. They were obviously targeted because of their Japanese heritage by the U.S. government during wartime. And although that's not an excuse for terrible behavior, you can understand how we got to that stage, right? Now, it is imperative that happened because future generations will not have the same issue, because the U.S. Supreme Court did say it is unconstitutional to detain U.S. citizens without cause like that. And so if we, let's say in the future, randomly go to war with, Canadians or whoever else, It's not like we're going to round up every person of Canadian descent in the U.S. and throw them into internment camps. So at least we're learning from our mistakes. But as far as afterwards, how did the Japanese American community thrive and prosper? They ended up going back towards work. They ended up incorporating themselves into the American system, and they ended up suing the U.S. government for reparations. And so as they were suing the U.S. government, it took a few decades for them to get everything that they needed to, but they eventually were compensated billions of dollars for the injustice of being stripped away from their homes and losing their house, their cars, their money, everything they saved up, right? They were kind of set back. And so thankfully, during the second half of the 20th century, Japanese Americans were not too much in the spotlight, right? For better or worse, working hard, building up their community. Thankfully, nothing terrible was happening on that end. And so even up to today, the Japanese American community is thriving strong. And thankfully, we can look back at all of these events in history and hopefully learn for the present and the future, right, moving forward with other ethnic groups and identities. But I wanted to thank you for being here for Chapter 7. I hope you liked it, hoped you enjoyed it, and we're going to move on through Chapter 8 and 9. See you on the next one.